The Western media became fascinated with mummies after the rediscovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922. That fascination turned into a full-on frenzy when British adventurer George Edward Carnarvon, who was one of several people to enter the tomb, died a few months later. Thus, the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs was born. There had been movies made about mummies at least as far back as 1911, but Universal was the one to really capitalize on the sensational curse aspect in 1932, and many similar movies have been made since. Between America and England, 14 mummy movies have been made since 1932, and a whopping 10 of them came out before 1970. I briefly point this out because I occasionally see people say that everything nowadays is either bad or a remake or both, and I find it a bit funny when people say that because others have been saying this exact same thing for a long time now.
Shut up, I'm rich. I'm richer than all this new Hollywood trash.
What I'm trying to say is that this is not a new phenomenon. Sequels and remakes and film adaptations are practically as old as the original works themselves. Plus, while they don't always get the funds and attention they deserve, plenty of good and original things have come out in recent years, but I digress. With all that being said, as much as I'd love to, it would take more time than I have right now to compare all those mummy movies, so I'm going to focus on 4. The original 1932 one that started it all, the 1959 one that seems to be the second most loved of the earlier mummy movies, the 1999 one because, let's face it, it's probably the one most people think of when they hear The Mummy, and the 2017 one because it's the most recent. After the success of Frankenstein and Dracula, Universal was eager to put out another monster picture. They enlisted writers Nina Wilcox Putnam and Richard Scher to come up with an idea. Their 9-page treatment was named Cagliostro, after the 18th century Italian occultist Alessandro di Cagliostro. I think I'm saying that right. In their story, Cagliostro is an Egyptian magician who keeps himself alive for 3,000 years by injecting himself with nitrates. Universal enlisted screenwriter John L. Balderston to turn the treatment into a script, focusing less on the science fiction aspect of the original treatment and more on the monster. Balderston, who started his career in journalism, covered the story of the discovery of King Tut's tomb and the alleged curse surrounding it, so he focused heavily on these aspects when writing the script. The film underwent a couple titles, including Imhotep and The King of the Dead, but eventually settled on the simple yet effective title we know and love it as The Mummy. In it, we start with the cold open of archaeologist Sir Joseph Wimple leading an expedition in Egypt in 1921. His young assistant Ralph is eager to investigate the mummy they find and accidentally brings him to life when reading from a scroll they found along with it. The newly risen Imhotep takes the scroll and bounces, which causes Ralph to give what is quite possibly the most realistic and chilling reaction I've seen in any of these movies. I mean, seriously, who wouldn't burst into a fit of insane laughter after witnessing a mummy rise from the dead? 10 years later, we're introduced to Joseph's son, Frank. Frank is leading his own expedition in Egypt, a place Joseph vowed to never return to after the inexplicable events that happened 10 years earlier. A weird-looking guy named Ardith Bey introduces himself to Frank and tells him where he might be able to find the grave of Princess Anksunamun. One thing leads to another, and Joseph realizes that this Ardith Bey fellow is actually Imhotep, and a young woman named Helen, who is a half-Egyptian reincarnation of Anksunamun, falls in love with Frank, even though they've only known each other for about a day. Their love proves difficult, however, as Anksunamun's spirit struggles to pull itself to the surface and return to Imhotep. Helen is growing weaker the more she resists Imhotep's pull on her. She eventually gives in and heads to the museum where Imhotep plans to complete a ritual that will make her immortal and secure Anksunamun's spirit as the sole resident in Helen's body. But when he reveals that he has to kill her for the ritual to be complete, Helen/Anksunamun gets cold feet and decides that she doesn't want to endure the pain of death in order to complete it. She calls upon the god Isis for help, and Isis burns the scroll that brought Imhotep to life, which takes away Imhotep's immortality and kills him. Now Helen and Frank, who showed up to the museum but didn't really do anything, can be together forever. Yay. Okay, so I really wanted to love this movie. After all, it's a classic, and originals are always better than the sequels and remakes, right? Well, there's quite a few people out there who do see this as the ultimate mummy movie. And to them I say great. To each their own, you know? This movie did have some great things going for it, which I'll touch on in a minute, but overall I wasn't very invested in it because of the lack of well-developed characters. I struggled to feel any suspense for them because I didn't know them well enough to care about whether they lived or died. Ralph, who is arguably my favorite character in the film, is only in the first scene and dies off screen. And aside from the cold open, which is probably my favorite scene in the whole movie, there isn't much conflict or camaraderie between the characters to make their interactions more interesting. I'm not saying that in order to be interesting, every main character needs to have an arc that rivals Michael Corleone's in The Godfather, but they need to have something going for them, and for me, these characters didn't. I think the actors did well with what they were given, but they just weren't given much, and my lack of investment in them really impacted my enjoyment of the film overall. But what this movie lacks in dynamic characters, it makes up for it with a great atmosphere and a great mummy, which, one might argue, are more important aspects of the film than the human characters anyways. Imhotep is played by Boris Karloff. Karloff the Uncanny is definitely an icon in the horror genre. Aside from his obviously most important role, which was voicing the Grinch in How the Grinch Stole Christmas, he also graced the screen as Frankenstein's a monster in Frankenstein a year prior to playing Imhotep. Makeup artist Jack Pierce used cotton soaked in clay to decorate Karloff's body with. It took 8 hours to apply to poor Karloff, and the clay kept getting in his eyes, but the results were great. The makeup, along with Karloff's physique and facial expression, created a genuinely disturbing mummy. I mean, look at that face. It honestly creeped me out a bit when it popped up on the screen, and it pops up more than once, so beware. Another thing I like about this version is the atmosphere produced. It's terrifically tense, and there are some beautiful shots in here. The lighting in particular really highlights the texture of Imhotep's face and adds extra dimension to the scenes. This isn't too surprising considering director Karl Freund is most known as a cinematographer who lent his talents to, among other things, the 1927 film Metropolis, the 1931 Dracula, and over 400 episodes of I Love Lucy. In fact, he created the flat lighting setup that's still used in sitcoms today because of how well it illuminates scenes from multiple angles. Another atmospheric element I noticed is that, especially compared to the later Mummies, this one doesn't have a ton of music. The lack of music in scenes that would for sure today have it really amplified the tension for me, and when the music does come up, it's perfectly placed and gives a great sense of dread. The 1959 Mummy was created by a British production company called Hammer Film Productions, and I've been saying it as Hammer this whole time, but I just now realized I'm not sure if it's Hammer or Hammer, so forgive me if I'm saying it wrong. Jimmy Sangster wrote the script, which takes most of its plot from the 1940 American movie The Mummy's Hand and its 1942 sequel The Mummy's Tomb. It's directed by Terence Fisher and photographed by Jack Asher. Hammer was going through a sort of horror renaissance at the time, creating their own versions of classic horror movies that are considered to be classics of their own today. In addition to directing this, Fisher also directed The Curse of Frankenstein in 1957 and The Horror of Dracula and The Revenge of Frankenstein in 1958. Peter Cushing, who plays protagonist John, and Christopher Lee, who plays the Mummy, had previously worked with each other and with Fisher on other Hammer horror films. This story starts in 1895. We bid adieu to Imhotep and say bonjour to Caris, who, like Imhotep, was mummified alive for trying to commit the unholy act of bringing his love Ananka back to life. John doesn't know this, though, and neither does his father Stephen or his uncle Joseph. They get ready to open Ananka's tomb when an Egyptian man named Mehmet Bey warns the digging party of the trouble they're getting themselves into. Of course, they don't heed the warnings, and when Stephen is alone in the tomb, he finds and reads from a scroll that awakens Caris. The sight of this causes Stephen to go crazy, and he's placed in a nursing home for the mentally disordered. 3 years go by with poor Stephen remaining practically catatonic and not even acknowledging his son, when one day he asks for John. In a state of mental clarity not seen since that fateful day in Egypt, Stephen tries to warn his disbelieving son about what happened in the tomb. This sudden fear and mental clarity might have something to do with the fact that Mehmet Bey has just moved into their neighborhood in England and has brought Caris with him. As punishment for desecrating Ananka's tomb, Mehmet Bey orders Karis to kill the archaeological party, starting with Stephen. One thing leads to another, and Karis kills Uncle Joe as well. He almost gets John until his wife Isabel rushes in. She bears a striking resemblance to Karis' long-lost love Ananka, so he leaves John alone when he sees her. All while this is going on, a very logical, very witty inspector named Mulrooney has been trying to figure out who is committing these murders. He reluctantly becomes convinced that the murderer might indeed be a 4,000-year-old mummy and enlists a few village people to help him protect John, who Karis and Mehmet Bey are attempting to kill again. A lot happens in the last 10 minutes or so. Karis incapacitates Mehmet Bey, or maybe that's a straight-up kill. I'm not entirely sure. We need James to kill count this. He then kidnaps Isabel and carries her to a swamp where some of the villagers are waiting with their rifles. They manage to shoot Karis a bunch of times, and he sinks to the bottom of the swamp. Aside from the plot, I found a couple key differences between this version and the original. For the first, I want you to take a look at a couple moments from each. Both of these scenes are meant to take place at the excavation site in Egypt.
Was that the last?
Okay, so I don't know about you, but I found it to be painfully obvious in this 1959 version that Egypt is actually a set in some studio. I believe that the exterior Egypt scenes in the 32 version were shot in the Mojave Desert, and this desert setting adds to the authenticity. In the 1959 version, there were multiple moments where I was taken out of the moment because of these fake-looking outdoor scenes. It made me realize how much I took for granted the beautiful cinematography and immersive sets of the original. Part of me thinks I'm being a little too hard on this film since it was made in 1959 and it did feature more ambitious events than the original, like an explosion, a crate falling off a carriage, Karis rising up from the pond, Karis breaking through windows, and so on and so forth. And to be fair, this version does have some lovely cinematography of its own. But ultimately, my point still stands. I was not a fan of these outdoor sequences. Another difference was the music. Like I mentioned earlier, there wasn't a lot of music in the original. I think that suited it well and contributed to the creepy atmosphere. This version has a lot more music, with a great score composed by Franz Reisenstein. The fact that there's more music in this version isn't automatically a bad thing. In fact, I think it helps with the grand, fantastical feel to the film overall. But there are also quite a few moments where I feel like the music wasn't necessary and diminishes the suspense. In fact, most of my favorite scenes in the film have no music, like this one when John visits Mehmet Bey to suss out whether or not he is the one controlling Karis.
You are an intruder. You force your way in. You remove the remains of the long-dead kings and send them to places like the British Museum.
The tension is high in this scene as John and Mehmet try to feel each other out while maintaining polite appearances. Except for a little music that quietly creeps in at the end, this scene is all diegetic sound, and I love that. The context of the scene alone provides plenty of suspense, along with the dialogue and great acting, so I don't need a piece of music telling me that I should feel suspenseful, because I just naturally do. The last big difference I noticed between these two movies was in the characters and their relationships with each other. You already know how I feel about the characters in the 32 version. The 59 version did not have this issue. I enjoy the addition of the comic relief characters who come in to offer some genuinely good humor after a heavy scene. Not only are they funny, but their antics play a role, albeit small, in the story. And I much prefer this father-son relationship than the 32 version's father-son relationship. John and Steve only share a few minutes on screen together, but the way they interact with each other and the way they talk about each other does a great job of showing their bond. And it gives this scene of John visiting Stephen in the home some real emotional weight to it.
You're a fool, John. Thank you for coming.
Ultimately, that's where these characters succeed where the 32 versions don't, in my opinion. Now, I'm not saying that they're gonna win any awards for being the most interesting or lovable characters put to film, but they're allowed to stop and react and contemplate before rushing along to the next plot point, which makes them feel more fleshed out. Their dialogue and interactions move the story forward, but still allows them to just be. And of course, before moving on, we have to shine some light on the mummy himself. While I prefer Imhotep's bandage look to Karis's, the 6'5" tall Lee does a great job of making this mummy look physically imposing. Using mostly just his eyes and body language, because that's about all he can use, Lee still thoroughly expresses Karis's emotions. You can see when he's angry, when he's conflicted, when he's sad. Also, props to Lee for doing so well with such a physically demanding role. He dislocated his shoulder bursting through that door, and threw out his back carrying the actress Furneaux, but he made a damn good mummy. In general, though, Karis himself wasn't as scary as Imhotep to me, because Karis was more like a hitman following orders from Mehemet Bey, as opposed to being his own person and acting from his own desires. I tried to remain relatively unbiased when putting this video together, but I gotta admit, this is my favorite version of the four. Is it perfect? By no means, but I love that it doesn't try to be something it's not. It's a big-budget, high-concept action adventure, and it gives you everything you expect from these things. We've got fun characters played by actors with great chemistry. I mean, come on, how adorable is this scene?
Go ahead, it's something I borrowed off our American brethren. I thought you might like it, you might need it for when you're down. Yeah.
We've also got plenty of comic relief, plenty of action, plenty of adventure, and, well, because the movie is called The Mummy, then damn it, we've got plenty of that too. If you go into this Mummy movie expecting the intense atmosphere of the 32 version it's adapted from, you're gonna be disappointed. In fact, between the music, the comedic moments, the more intriguing characters, and the grand theatrical feel to the film overall, this version seems much closer to the 59 version to me, although in reality all three are pretty distinctly different from one another. The story begins in ancient Egypt, where we see the high priest Imhotep kissing the very scantily clad Anck-su-namun. The problem with this is that she's the pharaoh's mistress, so they kill the pharaoh when he discovers their betrayal. Imhotep escapes with his priests and vows to revive Anck-su-namun, who kills herself when confronted by the pharaoh's bodyguards. The resurrection ritual is almost complete when the pharaoh's guards track them down and stop it. As punishment, Imhotep's priests are buried alive, and Imhotep himself receives a punishment so terrible it hadn't even been done before. And should he ever be raised from the dead, the same curse that was placed upon him will bestow him with unimaginable power. We then fast forward to 1926, where we're introduced to our leading man Rick O'Connell and his buddy Benny. In the midst of some standoff, Benny hightails it out of there, leaving Rick practically for dead until an ominous face in the sand scares away his would-be murderers. He wanders through the desert and eventually ends up in jail, where Egyptologist Evelyn and her treasure-hunting brother Jonathan track him down to see if he'll help them find Hamunaptra, the rumored ancient city of the dead. They know about Hamunaptra's existence in part because of a map and key Jonathan stole from Rick, and they need Rick's help getting there after the map is burned by Evelyn's boss. In exchange for Evelyn having gotten him out of jail and saved his life, Rick agrees to take them there. Evie, Jonathan, and Rick are in a race of sorts with a group of Americans also trying to get to Hamunaptra with our good buddy Benny's help. One thing leads to another, and Evelyn reads from a book that brings Imhotep to life. He one by one tracks down the Americans who stole his organ jars so that he can revive himself to full power, and once he does that, he takes Evie away from Rick and Co. The Co here consists of Jonathan, a fellow whose name is never stated but is credited as Ardith Bey, and Evie's boss, who, along with Ardith Bey, is a part of a secret society devoted to preventing Imhotep from being resurrected, which explains why he burned the map to Hamunaptra in a much earlier scene. Imhotep takes Evie to Hamunaptra so that he can kill her in a ritual that will bring Anck-su-namun back to life in Evie's body, but Rick and Co., minus Evie's boss who is at this point dead, manage to stop Imhotep from completing the ritual and strip him of his immortality, which allows Rick to deliver a fatal stab to the gut. Actually, Imhotep just kind of walks into it himself, but, you know. Benny, who spent pretty much the entire climax gathering treasure, accidentally triggers a trap that essentially self-destructs the whole pyramid. He doesn't make it out in time, which, honestly, I find kind of sad. Every time I watch this, I can't help but root for Benny to make it out and become a better person. Anyways, Rick, Evelyn, Jonathan, and Ardith Bey do make it out, and just in time for our leading man and woman to fall in love as they head off into the sunset. I don't find the overall execution of any of these three versions to be all that scary, but I'd say that the 32 version in particular has a slight edge over this version in terms of tension. I think it's because the events of the first two happen on a much smaller scale. It's easy to get really scary when the story is so intimate and the stakes are so personal. There's a bunch going on in the 99 version. It's got lots of characters, side adventures, and the looming threat of Imhotep essentially wanting to wreak havoc on the world. And while broad stakes like these work well for high-concept action adventures, they typically fail to incite the same horror associated with more personal stakes. Also, aside from the cold open, this movie spends the first hour or so being a fairly comedic action adventure with bits of suspense sprinkled throughout, whereas the first two are much more deeply embedded in the suspense and horror of it all pretty much from beginning to end. That isn't to say that this version doesn't have any suspenseful moments. Case in point, the bone Imhotep has to pick with the Americans who stole his organ jars. I find the most successfully suspenseful parts of this movie are when he's hunting them down to enact his personal revenge. If they really wanted to take the horror route with this story, they easily could have by trimming a solid 30 minutes off the runtime and changing the concept to focus almost exclusively on Imhotep hunting down the jar thieves. And slightly off topic, but when doing a bit of research for this, I found out that apparently there were several people previously attached to this project who had hopes of making it much darker and more horrific. One such person was Clive Barker. I'm personally not familiar with him, but he's mostly a playwright and novelist, with both the Hellraiser and Candyman film series being adaptations of his work. Barker stated that, quote, "Our version of the Mummy was precisely what the powers that were at Universal did not want. It made the Mummy story over for the late 20th century, not in terms of effects, but in terms of content," end quote. One of the main characters was meant to be a transgender woman who the audience would have seen born a boy in the beginning of the movie. It would have been revealed by the third act that that male child became the seductive and murderous heroine they'd been following throughout the story. And the story itself revolved around an occultist who works at a museum trying to revive all the mummies there. George Romero, director of the 1968 horror classic Night of the Living Dead, also brought an idea to Universal that involved both Imhotep and Karis being risen from the dead, with Imhotep trying to adapt to modern life while Karis wants revenge on those who desecrated his grave. Universal obviously scrapped both ideas, likely out of fear that they were too dark and lacked the appeal to attract a large audience. But as someone who'd love to see a straight-up terrifying mummy brought to life on the big screen, it's interesting to think about what could have been. Writer-director Stephen Sommers emphasized that he didn't want a typical mummy wrapped in bandages. He worked with the company Industrial Light and Magic, known as ILM, to create the film's VFX. He knew that this mummy was meant to be a product of its time and wanted to provide grand special effects and action to go alongside the retelling of this classic story. For the most part, I think the effects are great and hold up to this day. And considering the feel they were going for, I think it was a good choice on Sommers' part to stray away from the whole bandaged mummy look that his predecessors used. All that being said, I still stand by Karloff being the most frightening-looking mummy. There's just something about the texture of his bandages and the facial expressions Karloff makes that really sends a chill down your spine. However, Arnold Vosloo's mummy is no slouch. He's by far the most powerful of the three, and even when he's just strutting around in his fully human form, he manages to look suave and physically imposing. For as much as I love the 32 version's Imhotep, he's kinda lanky and slow-moving, and it just looks like a strong gust of wind could easily knock him over. Lee's mummy is physically imposing and much stronger than the average human, but I still get the impression that 3 or 4 men could gang up on him and tackle him to the ground. Plus, all it took was a bunch of bullets to take him out, which I think is a pretty anticlimactic end to a mummy. Imhotep, on the other hand, can drain your life from you, command armies, conjure up sandstorms, and won't hesitate to throw you around a room. Sure, he's scared of cats, but he grows out of that phase pretty quickly. I could go on about my feelings on this movie. For the sake of time, I left a lot of stuff out. Some of it, like the cinematography, I chose not to touch on in detail because I don't think there's much to say. Cinematography is fine, it gets the job done, but I appreciate the camera work in the previous 2 versions more, particularly in the 32 version where a lot of shots felt adventurous and motivated. Other things, like how I'm really not a fan of the way most of the Arab characters are portrayed as either slaves or laughingstock, I'm not touching on because, honestly, I really don't know how to go about doing so. And even if I did, a topic like this would probably be better suited for its own separate video. What I will say is that representation does matter, and maybe I'm looking too deeply into things, but this representation is something that caught my eye the last few times I watched this movie. Again, I tried to be relatively unbiased when putting this video together, but I had pretty low expectations when watching the 2017 Mummy. Maybe it was thanks in part to these low expectations that I didn't hate it. We start in modern-day London, where a construction party stumbles upon a bunch of underground tombs. The site is taken over by a man named Henry and his mysterious crew. One of the markings on the wall is obviously Egyptian. This leads to a flashback of ancient Egypt where we see Princess Amenet training to become the next pharaoh. Things are going pretty well for the only child until her father's mistress gives birth to a son. Amenet knows that he will become the next pharaoh instead of her, which kinda sucks since she's been training her whole life for the role and really wanted it. So she makes a deal with Set, the god of death. Their plan is to take over the world, which first involves Set allowing some sort of evil, powerful essence to enter her body, I guess. Then she kills her family, including the little baby bro. The next step in the plan is to use the dagger of Set to bring him into the physical world with a male host. Before that part can be completed, though, Amenet is found by the pharaoh's guards and buried alive. Her body is carried far away from Egypt into modern-day Iraq, which is where the story picks up in the present with American soldiers/treasure hunters Nick and Chris. Nick tracks down the location written on a note he stole from an Egyptologist he had a one-night stand with, hoping to find something of value to loot there. Said Egyptologist named Jenny makes her way to the location as well and is immediately ready to begin investigating the site when she sets her eyes on an Egyptian monument, the same one we saw earlier in front of Amenet's resting place. Nick's commanding officer orders them to venture into the ominous hold to help Jenny. Once inside, Amenet reveals herself to Nick in a vision where she informs him that he set her free, which I believe happened when he shot at some sort of pulley mechanism to lift her coffin out of a vat of mercury. Looks like she plans on thanking Nick by using him as Set's host body. Amenet uses her bird powers to crash the plane in England because that's where the dagger of Set is located, and she needs that to complete the ritual. Jenny is technically the only person who survives the crash since Nick gave her a parachute as the plane was falling. Nick, too, was among the dead, but miraculously and inexplicably comes back to life. One thing leads to another, and it's discovered that Jenny actually works for Dr. Henry Jekyll, the man from the opening scene. Henry and his crew aim to eliminate evil from the world. He plans on killing Amenet because, well, for obvious reasons. He also plans to kill Nick because stabbing him with the dagger will bring Set into Nick's body, and once there, they can kill Set himself. They escape Dr. Jekyll/Mr. Hyde, and Jenny gets the idea to find and destroy the stone that must be attached to the dagger of Set for the ritual to work. They set out to find the stone, but Amenet finds it first. She then finds them and drowns Jenny. Nick fights back against Amenet, who honestly could have stabbed him with the dagger 10 times over by now, but can't, of course, because the plot won't allow it. I won't nag on this too much, though, or else I'd have to do the same for the 99 version. Because let's be honest, there were plenty of times during the climax where Imhotep could have killed Rick and Jonathan if he really wanted to. Anyways, Amenet sings the lyrics to her favorite Sarah Vaughan song, "Give In." And thanks to all her stalling, Nick is able to pickpocket the dagger away from her. After some contemplation, Nick stabs himself with the dagger, thus allowing Set to enter his body. But Nick is still in there too, and he uses his newfound power to kill Amenet and bring Jenny back to life. He then brings his old pal Chris back to life, and together they begin searching for a way to get rid of Set, while Henry and Jenny debate over whether or not Nick will be strong enough to fight off the evil inside him. So, like I said, I don't think this movie is as terrible as some people make it out to be, but it is lacking in a lot of ways. When talking about the 99 version, I mentioned that most big-budget, high-concept action adventures tend to have a few things. Fun characters played by actors with great chemistry, plenty of comic relief, plenty of action, and plenty of adventure. To give credit where it's due, this movie does have some fun action sequences and a decent set piece or two, though, in my opinion, not on par with the set pieces of the previous 3. The main issue comes in with my first 2 points about fun characters and comic relief. Now, action adventures aren't meant to be straight-up comedies, so they don't have to make the audience laugh every 30 seconds. But let's be honest, most of them do try to throw in funny lines and reaction shots wherever they can. This one has, one really funny moment that I can think of.
You gave me the only parachute without hesitation.
I thought there was another one.
Make that 2. I know that comedy is very subjective, but a lot of other moments in this movie that I can tell are supposed to be funny just aren't to me. Most of this supposed humor comes from the characters yelling each other's names, which I found more annoying than anything. And I don't know whose idea it was to cast Tom Cruise as Nick, but the dude only had like one reaction face throughout the whole movie. I think someone else could have done that part much better. Another advantage that the previous three have on this movie is their stories. The first two in particular are rather simple and straightforward in their plots and character motivations. Now, this isn't to say that simple is always better, but generally speaking, it's easier to get invested in a story when you understand the character's motivations and the rules of the world. And I know I said that the 99 Mummy has a lot going on, but it still feels cohesive because it all either builds towards or comes from the main obstacle for our heroes to overcome, which is defeating Imhotep. Maybe I'm just not as smart as I'd like to think I am, but there were lots of things in this version that really didn't make sense to me, and the most glaring one was Amenet's backstory. Like, why did she need to make a deal with Set just to kill her family? I feel like killing your family in order to take over their position wasn't a completely unheard of thing back then, so I don't understand why she felt the need to call upon Set and plot to take over the world for an issue she could have easily fixed herself. Like, seriously, how do you go from wanting to be Pharaoh to wanting to call upon the god of death and bring about destruction on the whole world? It don't add up, but maybe that's just me overthinking it. This 17 version was a part of Universal's Dark Universe, which might deserve its own video because honestly I love the idea of a dark universe, and it's been wild reading articles about everything that's gone wrong with it so far. But anyways, because of the whole, dark part of the Dark Universe, I wouldn't be surprised if they were intentionally trying to make this a bit more creepy and unsettling than the 99 version. Unfortunately, I think their idea of creepy and unsettling mostly meant jump scare noises and low-lit, greenish-colored scenes. I will say that Amenet herself had some great moments. Probably my favorite part in the whole movie, aside from this part, is when Nick and Jenny are driving away from Amenet and Jenny realizes that Amenet is in Nick's head influencing his decisions. He denies this, only to end up having subconsciously driven right back to her. Also, I have a love-hate relationship with how Amenet kills people essentially by kissing them and sucking the life out of them. I love it because it just looks so gross and creepy, and I hate it for that very same reason. There's something about killing people in that manner that just feels so violating and uncomfortable and sends a shiver down my spine. Even at the end when Nick uses that move to kill her, I can't help but feel a bit sorry for her. Long story short, whoever's idea it was to add that in deserves a pat on the back. There's so much more I could say about all these movies, but I think I covered the basics. Actually, in hindsight, I'm not even sure if I did that. This video is admittedly kind of all over the place. But at least it was fun to put together. And if anyone out there is still listening, hopefully it was fun for you to listen too. If I had to rank these from most to least favorite, the 99 version would be first because it's just an all-around really fun movie. Next would be the 32 version. Even though it suffers terribly due to its boring characters, it makes up for it quite a bit thanks to its mummy design and overall atmosphere. Plus, this opening scene is my favorite of the four. Following closely behind that is the 59 version. It has one of the most heartfelt moments of all four movies, plus decent cinematography when it's not outside, and intriguing characters. Mehmet Bey doesn't get a ton of screen time, and it isn't even until the end of the movie where we get to really hear more details about his motivations. But honestly, in this franchise about mummies, he's one of my favorite villains. I would have loved for a character like him to be further explored in later movies. And lastly would be the 17 version. If by some miracle anyone has managed to not only click on this video but stay to the end, well, first of all, thank you. And secondly, if you've seen all four of these movies, I'd love to know how you would rank them. Or if you've seen any of the other ones that I didn't go over, feel free to let me know what you thought of those too.